So what are some of the basic properties of life for some of the creatures that we're going to be taking a look at? Well, one of those is evolutionary adaptation. Like, for example, you can see the seahorse and the various coral material that he lives in the environment. You can see how well adapted he is, how well camouflaged he is. And that's an evolutionary adaptation that occurs over time. So evolutionary adaptation is certainly one of the hallmarks of living creatures. Response to environment, of course, is another property of living objects. For example, a rock doesn't tend to respond to its environment very much. When environmental conditions change, the rock doesn't respond. Here you have a good example of this plant, the Venus flytrap, how it responds when it touches or feels the touch of an insect that's caught in its modified leaf. Reproduction, of course, that is a property of life. Living things reproduce more living things, whether that's through the mammalian way that we're familiar with, like with the giraffe, or through basic division in the way that, say, a bacteria cell does. But reproduction is a hallmark of living things. Growth and development and change. You obviously are an upperclassman now, probably a junior or senior in high school. If you go back and look at your first day photos from kindergarten, you're quite a bit different now than you were back then. Mom and Dad will tell you that you have grown and changed quite a bit in that time. So growth, development, and change is a hallmark of living creatures. Energy processing. Not all creatures eat and drink and go to the bathroom the way that we do, but all living creatures take in energy in some form, process that energy, and get rid of waste products in some way. Regulation of some kind. There's a word, homeostasis, that perhaps you're familiar with. Here we see the jackrabbit's ears. Not only are they for hearing, but they're also for thermoregulation, regulating his body temperature and body heat. So again, trying to maintain a balance in an ever-changing environment, that also is a hallmark of living creatures. Finally, order. You'll find at many different levels, all the way down to the cellular level, all the way up to the entire organism or population and community, biosphere level that we're going to look at. You're going to find structure and order. Chaos is not very much a hallmark of life. Life tends to be well ordered, and it has to be well ordered and well defined for those processes to continue. So order and structure is also a particular property that we'll take a look at as we study throughout this semester. Your textbook is very good at dividing the information into concepts and themes, and we're going to divide these audio podcasts or videocasts into concepts as well. The very first concept in the textbook is labeled 1.1, and it talks about how there are particular themes that we'll take a look at. The themes of this book make connections across different areas of biology. So the very first theme is that new properties emerge at each level in biological hierarchy. In other words, what they're saying is you're going to see certain properties at varying levels. So we could look at the smallest unit of life, which is the cell, and you're going to see particular properties, and those are even cells. Single cells are going to exhibit the traits that we call life. But as you move up the chain, as you move up the biological hierarchy to complete organisms or even into populations, communities, you're going to see different properties come about. So the things that you see at the cellular level, you will see differing properties at higher levels. For example, we can start with the very smallest on the lower right here with molecules and atoms and organelles. These are structured and they are organized, but they are not living. So an organelle, a particular organelle of the cell, like a mitochondria, is not considered alive. It doesn't have all of the characteristics of living things. Once we bump up to the cell level, if you look right here where we jump to the cell level, at that point, now we're getting to the area that we would call alive. Even a single skin cell of your body has all the properties that living things have. Cells form together to create tissues of like cells. Those tissues form together to create organs and organ systems. So within the human body, we have the heart, or the circulatory system, made up of those tissues that work together. From there, we get entire organisms. You could be looking at an entire tree or an entire human being. Upward from there, we have populations. All of the aspen trees in a particular area, or all of the raccoons that live in a particular ecosystem, that would be a population. Going up from there, we have communities. That would include all the living creatures in one particular area. So in an East Texas forest community, that would include the trees and the earthworms and the insects and the deer, all the living creatures. Jumping up from that, we have the ecosystem. That is all the living things plus the non-living environmental factors, such as the amount of rainfall, the temperature, wind speeds, things of that nature. And then finally, the largest area of organization we would look at would be the biosphere, and that would be the entirety of living creatures on planet Earth. Emergent properties is an important particular element of what we're going to be studying. Emergent properties are things that result from the arrangement and interaction of parts within a system, and you'll see properties emerge at varying levels. And this is something that you'll see in biology, obviously. So, for example, to learn about biology, we have to use the human brain. Well, the human brain is made up of neurons. None of those individual neurons are in charge or the boss of your brain, and none of those single individual neurons can do the job that the entire brain does. So a functioning human brain emerges only when all of those parts are put together in the correct way. We also see these emergent properties in non-biological entities or examples, and a good one is a bicycle. You can tear a bicycle apart and you can look at all the functional pieces, and each of those pieces may have their individual job, but you can't ride it down the street until it's put together in the proper way and all those parts work together in the way that they should. When you're studying biology, you can really kind of take two approaches. One of those approaches is called reductionism, and the other one is systems biology. Reductionism is where we break it down. So we break down the complex creature or the complex system into its smaller parts. Say, for example, if we want to learn about DNA, we can go all the way down to the molecular level. We can study the chemistry of DNA, and that will help us understand a bit about genetics and inheritance, but it won't help us understand everything. So an understanding of biology has to be balanced with this breaking it down into the smaller parts, but also understanding that those smaller parts don't give you all the details and information that you need. Another way of looking at things is called systems biology. Systems biology is studying the entire model or system and how the parts interact. Say, for example, the textbook talks about a drug for blood pressure. Well, when they are testing drugs for blood pressure is not the only thing they're going to look at. They're going to take a look at how does this affect the other systems of the body. Or if you really want to study humans, say human biology or human anatomy, you don't look at just muscles or just the liver. You're going to study entire systems and how those systems work together. So there's two different approaches. You have reductionism, which breaks it down into its smaller parts, and there's something to be learned by doing that. But then you have systems biology, which is taking all those small parts, putting them together, and then discussing how they interact. Our next major theme in this first portion of the textbook is about that interaction, and it talks about how organisms interact with each other and the physical environment. If you're going to do systems biology, you're going to have to look at the interaction between living creatures and their environment. That would be considered a major part of ecology, which is a portion of biology. For example, you can take a look in the textbook how you have this picture of the tree and the elephant and the various other creatures. You can see a zebra in the background, and the grass on the ground and things like that. And you see a cycling of nutrients, you see sunlight coming in, you see carbon dioxide and oxygen being released or taken up by the different creatures, and you see energy flow between those creatures. This interaction is an important part of systems biology. One thing to consider is that although humans are a part of the natural world, because of some of our evolutionary adaptations, we have had the ability to modify our environment quite a bit. So for one good example that you've probably heard of is global warming. Global warming, of course, appears in the news quite a bit. And there's ongoing debate as to the exact causes and how much of that is human-caused. Most climate scientists would tell you that certainly there is a factor as far as human activity, but that is a good example of modification of the environment, interaction in the environment, including humans and human beings and what we do. So the next theme is that life requires energy, energy transfer and energy transformation. Of course, you know good and well that you probably couldn't last more than a few days without eating, and all other creatures are similar. They have to have energy flow. Now, they don't eat and drink necessarily the way that we do in the same manner, but there has to be energy flow through creatures for life to occur to maintain that organized state that we were talking about. So living organisms transform and transfer energy from one to another. Sometimes, in the case of plants, they have the ability to absorb sunlight and produce their own food and energy through photosynthesis, or in other cases, such as a dog or a human, they have to consume other living creatures or other materials to get that energy. So here you have a cute little monkey eating his piece of fruit. Of course, that fruit came from the plant. That plant absorbed the sunlight, used that energy to create its own food, and then that energy is being transferred to the monkey by him eating the fruit. When that monkey is jumping around through the trees, he's using that energy to do work. Some of that energy is converted into movement and motion. A lot of that energy is converted into heat, and some of that gets lost back to the environment from where it came. So energy flow from sunlight to producers to consumers, something you've probably studied since elementary school. And then, of course, using energy to do work. Again, just like your body produces heat when the muscles work, the monkey's body does the same, and some of that energy is lost as heat back to the environment. The next theme is that structure and function are definitely correlated at all levels. So you could look at the cellular level and look at the structure and function of things like the mitochondria or the nucleus, or you could go up and look at particular organs like the heart or the bones, and you'll find structure and function are inherently tied together. For example, in the gull's wing here, the structure of the bone, the way it's shaped, the formation of the bone with the hollow portions inside, that is directly related to its function, which is to allow the bird to fly, to be lightweight but strong. So you see structure and function at that level. Even down to the basic level of DNA, you'll see this structure and function. The next theme is that the cell is the smallest unit of life. It is the smallest unit that is organized in a way that allows for living things to continue their life, and we see a level of organization all the way down to that level. All cells, no matter what kind of cell or in what kind of creature, are enclosed by some sort of membrane, a cell membrane of some kind, and they all use DNA as their genetic information. Now you probably remember there's two basic kinds of cells. One of those is called eukaryotic. Eukaryotic cells are the cells that have organelles. They have the smaller parts inside. So human cells are eukaryotic. Most of the creatures that you would think of, like the creatures you see in a zoo, or the creatures you see outside of your school window, those are eukaryotic creatures. They have eukaryotic cells with parts inside. There are other cells called prokaryotic, the much more simple creatures, such as bacteria, that do not have organelles, do not have all of the organization in smaller pieces that the eukaryotes do. A good way to think about it is with a Venn diagram. In the middle, you see that both of these types of cells are living. They both use DNA. They're both versions of the cell. On the left, you have the prokaryotes, which are the more simple versions. They have no organelles, no nucleus. Their DNA floats freely inside. Then on the right, you have cells that are more akin to humans or most plants and animals. They're eukaryotic, greater level of organization, and they have organelles on the inside. Here you see another drawing or model of the two, kind of showing some of their relative size. Of course, different cells are differently sized and differently shaped. There you go back to that structure and function issue, but you can kind of see a relative comparison here of a prokaryotic cell in the upper right up here, and then of course a eukaryotic cell down there in the center of the picture. Our next theme talks about the continuity of life and how heritable information is passed on from parent to offspring in the form of DNA. Of course, DNA is the shortened version for deoxyribonucleic acid. DNA is the material that makes up your genes, your genetic code. Your genes are the units of inheritance that you got from your mom and dad. So your color of hair, your shape of your eyebrows, perhaps the ability to curl or not curl your tongue into the shape of a slender taco. All of those are genetic inheritance pieces that you obtained from your mom and dad when they reproduced and created you. The ability of these cells, whether it's a human and all the trillions of cells that make up a human, or a single-celled organism like a bacteria, the ability to grow and divide and repair itself is the hallmark of life, and the ability to pass on that information via DNA is what allows life to continue from one generation to the next. So a bit about the structure and function of the DNA. Of course, you're probably familiar with some of this. DNA is passed on, inherited by offspring from their parents, and it is ultimately what controls the development and maintenance of the organism, the creation of proteins, which is used to build, repair, maintain the living creature. So reproduction basically in humans would be a sperm cell from the male and an egg cell from the female. Those two are going to combine and form a complete genome. That fertilized egg contains DNA from both parents, and then that eventually develops into a full-grown baby, and it has the genetic traits, some from mom and some from dad. And of course, we'll go into genetics a little bit further later on in the semester. So the DNA molecule is two long interweaving chains in the form of a double helix. These two chains are made up of 4 nucleotides, and we'll probably get into a little bit of the chemistry a little bit more later, but they're simply designated A, G, C, and T based on their names. And what's interesting is that all living creatures share this genetic code, or the basic ingredients of this genetic code. On the page here is a good link you might want to check out. It basically asks, why is it that we have almost the same DNA as other things? It doesn't matter if you're comparing human beings to, say, chimpanzees, which are a close relative genetically speaking, or you're comparing human beings to an oak tree or to a fish in the ocean. You're going to find that much of the DNA is similar, and that the DNA itself is built out of these same nucleotides. So a good link there to check out and get some answers as far as why do all living creatures share the same DNA? And of course, the obvious biological reason is that we evolved from common ancestors, and so we share commonalities between these creatures. If you look at a model of DNA, it's going to look again like the double helix you've probably seen before. And then you have the various nucleotides listed off there to the right. They connect together with one another and form this twisted helix. The basic mantra of biology as far as the creation of proteins is DNA to RNA to protein. So genes control protein production sort of indirectly. You have DNA, which is then transcribed into a different molecule called RNA, and then the RNA is what actually kind of runs the whole protein manufacturing business of the cell. So the way you look, or the gene expression that you see that determines that you have 5 fingers or blue eyes, is basically a process of your DNA transcribing information to this molecule RNA. RNA tells the various cell parts how to make specific proteins, and that determines the features that you see, or the genetic expression of those particular traits. There are a couple of other words here that we might need to know: genome and genomics. So genome is basically the entire blueprint for who you are, or the genetic instructions for a particular creature. And human genomes have been completely sequenced. In other words, we know all of the nucleotides that make up that genome. We've also sequenced a number of other creatures at this point, chimpanzees, dogs, things of that other nature. So the ability to sequence the genome has been enhanced with some of the amazing supercomputers and technology that we have today. And genomics is a study of sets of genes within and between species, which is a very much an emerging and growing part of the study of biology. So none of this would be possible without some of the more advanced research ability that we have today with supercomputers and the like. It's difficult to imagine even 20 or 30 years ago, the idea of sequencing the entire human genome was pretty much out of reach, and now it's to the point where it's a common practice. The next theme is about feedback and regulation. I mentioned that word homeostasis. All living creatures have to contend with an ever-changing environment, and there's basically 2 ways that creatures have to deal with changes and to try to maintain this level of balance or homeostasis. One of those is negative feedback, and one of those is called positive feedback. Negative feedback is a way of slowing down or stopping a process, and positive feedback is a way of having that process speed up or continue. One of the ways I like to think about it is like a guy on a teeter-totter. In negative feedback, he's trying to maintain a balance where the right and the left side of the teeter-totter are both at the same level. And some examples of this are temperature control in the human body. When your body starts to overheat, your body produces sweat, which helps to cool you off and bring that temperature back into balance. Another good example is, say, insulin and blood sugar. If you eat a big dessert filled with sugar, your body is going to counteract that by releasing insulin created by the pancreas to try to keep your sugar levels in your blood at a certain level, not too high, not too low. This is the method that you see most often in living systems, negative feedback. A great example is if you went to the movies this summer, especially during the middle of the day when it's 100 degrees outside, to escape the heat, you go inside. It's amazingly bright outside, and then you spend about 2 hours in a nice, cool, dark theater. Well, when you first step out of that theater back into the 3 o'clock in the afternoon sunlight, you can physically feel your pupils undilate or shrink quite a bit. They have become quite dilated and open inside the dark theater, and you can feel them close on you. And if you were to look in a mirror in that bright sunlight, you would see them become very small. And that's a way of maintaining or restricting the amount of light that enters into your eye. That's negative feedback, and it's your body's way of making sure that that amount of sunlight, there is so much sunlight that it damages the eye itself. So here we have negative feedback. A good example is these enzymes that are produced, or these products that are produced by these various enzymes, A to B to C to D. And as the amount of D builds up, as you get more and more D created, D has a negative effect on enzyme 1. So eventually D stops enzyme 1, and that shuts down the entire process. So D gets created until there's too much D, and then that actually slows or stops the entire process, and that's negative feedback. The opposite of this would be positive feedback. And if we're going to go back to the guy on the teeter-totter, this would be leaning one direction and wanting to continue to lean further and further that direction until that side touched the ground. Positive feedback is a little bit rare in living systems and maintaining homeostasis for obvious reasons. You're not maintaining a balance. You're tilting one way kind of on purpose. So some good examples, some of the hormones released when a woman goes into labor and is giving birth. Those hormones, once they begin, they kind of speed that process along and continue that process, make the contraction stronger until the birth takes place. Another good example is blood clotting, scab formation. It releases certain materials that have a positive feedback loop that continue that process and actually speed that process along. Once the clotting begins, that clotting actually speeds up until a scab is formed. So that's positive feedback. In that case, what you see is the product actually encourages or helps speed up the entire process. So here you have W to X to Y to Z, and this product Z actually has a positive feedback effect on enzyme 5, which actually increases the amount or speeds up the entire process as you accumulate that product. All right, we're going to stop right there. We're not going to go on to concept 1.2 just yet, so we'll stop right there. This first audio is fairly long. I'm going to try to make them a little bit shorter, and I'm going to try to get better at this. This is kind of the first time that I've done these audio versions as well. So stop right here, go check your email, go log on to social networking, go check out some cool cat videos online, and then come back and we'll pick up a little bit later.